Welcome back in the second session of the Himalayan Webinar Series. Yesterday we talked about the people and different settlements in the high ranges of the Himalayas. Today we'll be talking about the diversity of the landscape, the different terrains you will encounter as you traverse the high passes of the Indian Himalayas. This will be useful to prepare yourself with required gears to hike across these diverse terrains basically in the next session. Okay, let's get started. Here we see a shepherd on his way up to the Pir Panjal range, separating high range 5,500 meter high snow peaks separating the Chamba Valley from Lahore and Bangi. You can see that the terrain is quite challenging here, challenging in terms of steepness, in terms of extreme weather. We'll be talking about that in the next session. And then also the fragility of the landscape. The Himalayas are a very young, geologically speaking, young mountain range where you have heavy, kind of highly erosive landscape, which rocks, scree, as well as melting snow constantly kind of creates a changing landscape. We'll talk about a couple of aspects here. What is it to walk along a trail versus having no trail at all in the Himalayas? We'll talk about the lower altitude forests and meadows. And as we go higher up to the passes, we traverse across Scree, Moraines, snow and ice, glaciers and crevasses. Talk a bit about the situation near the passes, how to cross streams, what about landslides, and a couple of closing slides on shepherds. Here we can see the typical scenario in the lower altitude Himalayas, in this case Uttarakhand, the Pindari Valley. When I cross Uttarakhand from east to west across 30 passes below 4,000 meters, Uttarakhand is sprinkled with many villages, and many of these small hamlets are basically connected with beautiful laid out paths, which are also traversed by horses carrying goods between the various villages. These cobble paths, of course, make it very easy to traverse, even when the slopes are steep, as they give you a very clearly laid out horizontal way of traversing the valley. Sometimes it gets a little more steep here, but still a proper trail, nicely constructed along a steep slope high above a side valley of the Chamba Valley on the way to Kuvarasi at the base of the Indrahar Pass. Nice spots again, making it easy to traverse this near vertical slope high above the raging stream below. One of my favorites here on the way from Bara Bengal to the main Chamba Valley, a 25 kilometers out of this world rock path built along very steep rock faces high above the Ravi River, raging Ravi River below, that cuts through a very steep landscape. This is again like a kind of path that will require annual maintenance, as the landscape is very fragile and keeps tumbling down across these fragile slopes with very limited vegetation cover. Once you leave the paths and you come into trails like here deep inside the Dolador near a remote settlement of Deep Gods, these are typically paths which are less frequently used. So there's no point of building a permanent path here, but more like traversing through rocks and routes inside the forest between remote settlements or trails only used by the shepherds. Then talking about trail versus off trail, as long as you have a trail actually or a path in the Himalayas, you can consider yourself to be lucky, because once the trail actually disappears and you're gonna traverse over the barren rock landscape of screes, loose rocks, snow and ice, it becomes much more challenging. Challenging in terms of finding your way, as there is no clear path to show you the way, often used paths, are also challenging in terms of the kind of dangers involved in crossing these kind of very steep and very kind of loose type of rock paths. Here we're going climbing up along a shepherd trail to the Margu Pass to cross over the Pir Panjal from Chamba into Lahore. You can still see a kind of a trail here, as the sheep have basically traversed and exposed the soil along this trailless path. Okay, let's talk a little about the different types of terrains now. As you start from the lower altitude, deep inside, apologies for the noise of my birds in the background. I hope it's not overtaking my explanation too much. So as we start from the lower valleys, say below 3,000 meters, we can walk through beautiful lush green forest, like here the Barrel Valley, beginning of the Barrel Valley, below the Makuri Pass on the way to Barabangal. Very beautiful pine forest, ancient forest. As we cut above the tree line, say above 3,000 meters, we come into beautiful alpine meadows, and the amount of water is less, not enough water to grow trees, or not enough soil. So we only have grasslands here, dotted by all colors of rainbows through beautiful flowers. As we climb from the alpine meadows above the vegetation line, we come into a landscape of rock and ice, where there's not enough water to basically sustain any vegetation or trees. So here we can see a herd of yaks carrying goods to a semi-nomadic village of Dibling in the Orna River Valley in Zanskar, just below the Pudong La Pass, walking on a slanting slope of loose rocks and soft soil, which makes it quite difficult to walk on. Here another typical Scree type of slope, mix of soft soil, which still has meltwater, so melting snow, combined with loose rocks, make it like a very kind of landslide-prone landscape, difficult to climb up against. When you then further go up towards the glaciers, which typically hang near the ranges and the passes, you come across large fields of moraines inside the valley. So these are, if we zoom in, big boulders and rocks on top of a melting glacier. So in constant movement, actually, impossible to create any permanent trail here as the landscape keeps changing. An example here of a small video traverse across the moraines above the Chovia Glacier. Welcome to Moraine Land. Big piles of rubble and big rocks on top of a glacier as we approach most of the passes. Bit tricky to walk as some of these big rocks, even though they seem very stable, they're loose, and one wrong step could lead to an 128-hour experience. Join me for a walk. Bit like Nagala bouldering, but a bit more tricky. Rocks are sharp and loose, so a bit tricky overall. Okay, once we cross the field of moraines and we hit the exposed glaciers, it becomes again more easy. You have a kind of a flat landscape, flat sheet of frozen ice, which normally is quite easy to traverse if it's not a steep gradient. The outer layer of the glacier is quite rough and gives a fairly good grip, especially towards later in the day when the ice melts a little bit and again soft ice mixed with little stones and soil. It makes it fairly easy to traverse. Here a small video traversing the Kalihini glaciers, connecting Kulu and Barabangal. We're just below the Kalihini Pass, covered by a big glacier. Walking up, following traces of the horsemen who regularly cross this pass. Water is cutting through the glaciers.
in several parts, forming lines and eventually.
Voila. And then coming to the not so easy glaciers are the ones that have been affected by heavy melt, like the Chobia Glacier here hanging from the Pir Panjal, separating Chamba and Lahore. You can basically see deep cuts of melt into the frozen ice, which are called crevasses. Very risky, as if you slip into these, especially as a solo hiker, there is no way out of these. Join me for a small walk now across the crevassed Chobia glaciers.
Join me for a small walk on the glacier below Chobia. Heavily crevassed all around us. Come. Big crevasses. Pair of ice poles is quite handy here, not to fall inside those deep craters behind us. Heavy crevasses. Trying to,
well, as you can see, these kind of glaciers are more tricky to traverse. Here's an example of a moulin. A moulin is basically a vertical shaft cut, sometimes 100-meter deep vertical shafts cut by meltwater into the ice sheet of a glacier. There we go.
Water is melting from the top of the glacier, and water canals are joining each other, increasing in force and flowing into crevasses.
Okay. So then let's talk about snow. Snow is a very interesting thing. It can make it both more challenging to traverse a frozen steep landscape, or it can also make it easier to climb up a pass which is covered by snow. Let's take a couple of examples. Here we have a crossing of a steep valley slope in the Ralam Valley through luckily soft snow, so we're able to actually cut steps inside the snow with my shoes, and with the help of hiking poles get a proper balance.
Follow me on this snow crossing in the Ralam Valley. Final section before we hit the opposite side from where we can reach Ralam in another 2 kilometers. Walking on snow is all about feeling the underground. If the snow is soft, it's quite easy. Also depends on the angle. If it's too slopey, then it becomes a little bit risky. The main thing is to shut out the mental fear. I think I'm the first guy to open the route to Ralam.
Okay, so as you can see, soft snow actually sometimes makes it easy to cross steep slopes as you get proper foothold in an otherwise exposed scree, which would be very steep and landslide prone. Things become a little more challenging though when we talk about those typical frozen snow gullies, especially early morning when the snow is hard, or at the beginning of the summer when there is less melt yet. Traversing like frozen snow along a very steep slope is impossible, as you cannot cut with your shoes and make steps. So in that case, you'll need some tools.
More snow on the way to Indrahar. Little bits steeper here, so cutting deeper steps to get up vertically. Hoppa. Lucky we have two hands, one for the Isaacs and one for the camera. Thanks Ravi for this useful piece of equipment from the US. Voila, that was a bit steeper one. Getting a little Dollador are typically quite steep.
Voila. And then once we go across all these terrains, starting from forest to alpine meadows to scree slopes, rocks, moraines, glaciers, solid glaciers, crevasses, moulins, and then snow. Then we finally come close to the passes actually to cross over a high range. In case again, as I mentioned, passes are covered with snow, and it's not like frozen snow. A little bit later in the morning when the snow becomes soft, can make it easy to get up these final steep sections, typically towards the passes. In case of exposed passes without snow cover, here the Chobia Pass across the Pir Panjal between La Jolla and Chamba, you kind of typically come across loose scree, rocks again, and especially towards the end of the pass, things tend to get quite steep and sometimes risky, sometimes a bit technical to get up there. So again, having the same landscape covered with soft snow sometimes makes it easier. A couple of pass crossings here by shepherds. This is the Kuchti Pass, providing a gateway from La Jolla to Chamba Valley. Shepherd crossing over with 500 sheep over this 5,150 meter high pass. Behind you can see the high ranges of La Jolla. Here a massive herd of sheep queuing up over hundreds of meters, making a small temporary trail across loose scree and rocks, and crossing over to the pass into beautiful Chamba below. Stunning views. Like another beautiful picture to show you the kind of steepness of the passes. Here again, we're looking at the Pir Panjal range separating La Jolla from Chamba, specifically at the Darati Pass. So the height difference between Darati here and the Alpine Meadows, where you finally step onto firm footholds, where the trail becomes a bit easier, is 1,000 meters near vertical drop. Within the yellow circle here in the middle, there are 500 sheep, which obviously are not very visible given the huge landscape we are looking at. From a distance, it almost looks as impossible to get up this near vertical landscape here to the top of the Pir Panjal. But again, shepherds passing on the knowledge of small kind of sections of labyrinth trail, helping them across this near impossible vertical drop across the Pir Panjal has allowed these big herds to cross these steep sections. Another big challenge, especially in late summer, is the crossing the wild streams. Again, as you go to the remotest corner of the Himalayas, there are no proper bridges. As you come down from the passes deeper into the valleys, the volume, the force of the water picks up, and it can become very challenging or impossible to cross these dangerous stream currents. In best case, you might have some makeshift bridges built by the shepherds. If you go into the high altitude desert of Sanskar and La Jolla, it becomes even more challenging, as again during peak summer, the big glaciers generate a lot of meltwater, which then gets cut through this fragile landscape through very narrow gorges and canyons, which become almost impossible to cross. Here, just to give you a flavor of the intensity of the water stream crossing on the way to the Pass. Human being only has 2 points of contact, so as we step above this unknown river depth, pushed sideways by heavy stream currents, it becomes of course very tricky as you get past the lane downstream. So important is to have 1 or 2 more points of contact, a pair of hiking poles or a stick. And the best way is actually to face your stream, so sideways and your face towards the lake and the currents. As soon as you go deeper inside the middle of the stream and you go back to your hip and forward, the water is so strong that it becomes really tough to remain upright. Landslides, as I mentioned, the Himalayas are a very young mountain range, geologically speaking, so there is a constant kind of sliding of rocks and loose scree. In some cases, when there is like an unusual cloudburst, here again in the Pindari Valley, again seen more frequent in recent times due to changes in climate. Then, because of the very fragile and thin top layers above the mountain, parts of the mountain simply get washed away. And then traversing the steep slopes above the raging rivers below, stepping onto a loose scree and rocks is very dangerous affair. Here we can see a live experience crossing a landslide prone slope on the way to
August
the
25. We are on the way to the Chobia Pass from Pangi to Chamba again after finishing Meyer Valley. So following the Gadi trails carefully step by step. The path is quite steep up here. Every step we need to be careful, as one wrong step lands you up 100 meters down in the stream.
Okay, so this gives you a feeling. Here another landslide seen this year, again in the somewhere in the Borod Valley on the way to the Tamsar Pass to Barabangal, where actually the entire mountain, all the way from the top above 500 meters down to top 300 meters left to right, the whole mountain came down, even though there was a proper forest cover, again due to unusual rainfall in this high altitude ranges, very fragile slopes of the Himalayas. Another interesting landscape are the snow bridges. So during the winter, during heavy snowfall, the streams get covered by initially snow, which then gets compacted in very thick sheets of frozen compacted snow or ice, which cover the stream completely and only melt towards the end of the summer. So this can make it sometimes easy to cross the valley, cross the raging stream, which otherwise would have been impossible. Here we're walking down such frozen snow bridges on top of the Kalihini Nala on the way to Barabangal.
We're standing on the river flowing to Barabangal from the Kalihini Pass. Big chunks of ice remain at the end of the summer this year due to heavy snowfall. Last year we did not see any ice over here. This year it simply won't melt. The ice chunks break under their own weight. Must be tons and tons of kilograms compressed snow here.
Okay, and then again, glaciers are always melting, so typically giving birth to streams below. If those streams get blocked again by rocks and landslides along the way, then they give form to these beautiful glacial lakes below the glaciers. A couple of words, final words on the shepherds. So as I mentioned, shepherds typically don't have the luxury of trails. They simply scramble up these steep slopes of rocks, snow, and loose scree on their way to the passes. Here you can see a view of the Glacial Pass, one of the more treacherous passes across the Pir Panjal as they migrate at the beginning of the summer from Chamba to the high ranges of Lahore. Again, as I mentioned, if there is snow cover, sometimes it makes it easier. They can make a proper path in the soft snow as compared to walking across the scree, the loose scree, steep rocks underneath the snow. Here we can see a beautiful descent of bells and sheep coming down the snow-covered Chorasi Pass in Chamba.
Herd of sheep from Barmar coming down the Chorasi Pass, 3,600 meters into the Chanju Nala Valley. Valley is fully snow-covered. Beautiful spectacle. Amazing.
And then another crossing here, a descent of an equally sized herd down the Margu Pass coming from the Pir Panjal into the valley of Lahore. Descending a steep rock face here below the pass.
Bakris are descending down steep rock faces below the Margu Pass, migrating from Chamba to Lahore and Pangi, coming from 4,300 meters up there. Some 5 shepherds and a couple of dogs are managing this huge crowd, guiding them through small passages, allowing them to get into the valley of the Chenab River. It's quite steep before we hit the meadows below.
Well, this gives you an idea of the challenge, the steepness, and the challenging landscapes that you come across as you traverse the high passes of the Himalayas. Again, if you have any doubts or questions, don't hesitate to drop them below this Instagram post or the YouTube video. I hope this gives you a better idea now on the variety and the challenging landscapes and terrains of the Himalayas, which will prepare us for the next session tomorrow when we'll be talking about the various gears to hike through these challenging landscapes. Thanks for watching this second session in the webinar series on the Himalayas.